Well, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jennifer Croker. I am the admin director of the CCTS Research Commons. And I want to thank you first and foremost for joining us this afternoon. I think that we're going to have a lot of fun. We have a fantastic panel of speakers today to kind of give us some insights as to what their current experiences are in fielding the rigor and transparency expectations of the NIH. Come on in if you're just joining us. I suspect we have a couple of folks joining us from our partner institutions and by remote, and so I'd like to extend my welcome to you as well. So I thought maybe I could just take a minute or two just to kind of frame the opportunity and then invite our panelists up to speak, and then really I think what we're hoping for is just really an open dialogue. Please, we welcome all of your questions that you might have. We recognize that since these expectations were set forth by the NIH, there was a lot of perhaps confusion or lack of clarity, or in some respects the NIH just said, you guys are investigators, figure it out. And that was kind of a difficult pill to swallow. But in any case, I think we're starting to find our feet under us. So suffice it to say, the NIH expectations really have been coming as part of several notices, most recently probably in the fall, and the implementation date was effective in January of this year and going forward. But in many respects, I'm sorry, is there a question? Are we live? Okay. In many respects, this is simply reinforcing what we've always done. We have always stood on the shoulders of previous peer-reviewed literature to show the opportunities and the scientific questions that need to be addressed. We have always worked very hard to justify our study design. And so this is really an opportunity for all of us to do this in a more formal way. The NIH has given us a few cues on how to do that. So again, just as background for why we're all here together, the NIH has asked that applications, whether investigator-initiated research proposals or career development proposals, as well as progress reports, and so I should underscore that it's really everything that we're sending, really needs to actively address several expectations. These expectations are implemented in the research strategy that you write, whether it's 6 or 12 pages, but it also includes additional appendices and probably can take advantage of some of the other attachments of the application. Some of these aspects are scored criteria, and we'll hear a little bit more about that today. And some of the expectations, while unscored, really are an opportunity for you as an investigator to really provide a foundation for the rigor of your scientific application. So without further ado, I'd really like to invite our panelists to join us up here in the front. And I'd like, perhaps one at a time, we might be able to ask them to introduce themselves, to give some insights as to the study section that they serve on, and then to offer a few points. So I should say that, if I'm not mistaken, all of our panelists are on members of study sections that are planning to meet in the next couple of weeks, which is to say, while they haven't met formally, they have been reviewing applications and they have been actively working in conversations and conference calls and webinars with CSR and the scientific review officer to understand the expectations of how this should proceed in their review. So perhaps I could invite everyone to come up and join me. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. I might ask Dr. Talbot, maybe we could kick off and you could introduce yourself, a little bit of background, and you might be able to highlight some points of what you've been hearing in your conference calls. Okay.
My name is Rita Cowell. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurobiology. So in the spirit of full transparency, I had a R1 that's just finishing up, and it had multiple grants going in, and part of my strategy to try to make all of my grants more competitive when they go in is to try to get as much exposure as I can to study sections. So I've not a standing number on study sections, but I've been on maybe, I think it's 11 in the past 14 months. But in part of that, so there are the SEPs, which are the kind of smaller ones that you can do like call-in. And so I've done maybe 6 of those and 5 actually sections where I was physically in the location with the whole study section to see what the review is like. And so the sections that I've been on are usually either related to work that may be funded by NINDS, so neurological disorders and stroke, or NIMH, so the mental health. And that's an important point, right? So they would end up being funded by them, but the sections themselves are not associated necessarily with institutes. So primarily what I've been seeing, all the grants that I've been reviewing tend to have a focus on animal models for disease. And these may be related to neurological disorders or some models for psychiatric disorders. And then also with the components of biochemistry and some molecular biology related to the different targets that people are looking at in these different disorders. So I've had a lot of just, been able to see the dynamics of these groups and also get a really good feel for what the audience is, because I've learned that's really important, that each kind of group is its own beast in a way, and so they have just their ideas of what they think may be important. It's that can vary then from some group to group. So I don't know if you want me to talk more about my section, or we're going to do introductions first.
That was fantastic. Okay. Are there any questions for Dr. Cowell? Great. Well, and perhaps I could ask Dr. Attar to comment on his experience and maybe some things he's heard about the relevance of biological variables.
So I'm in the Department of Dermatology, and I work mostly on skin cancers. I am permanent member of molecular oncogenesis, the study section, which deals with mainly the molecular pathogenesis of cancers and its intervention. So we look for the novel targets and try to have a translational component.
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
Oh yeah. I think there should be something here.
Yeah, we have some from the ceiling. But
okay. All right, I will try my So in my molecular oncogenesis study section, I think we look for a lot of things that are already being discussed here, but they were component of our grants, 12-page grants. For example, scientific premise or you can hear me? Yeah, scientific premise or animals, number of animals, sex, age, all these variables. But in some cases, the emphasis was not so much on these parameters. So they always discussed in animal section and that they will have equal number of males or females or like this. But now we have to give emphasis on all of these parameters and see all these variables are included, and if we are excluding anything, why we think so that that's not so important. So I must confess that I haven't been recently on the study section because my study section is due in mid of June and second week of June. So I will know more as I will have experience with the new policy. But what I think, and I have got all the slides, that they are going to emphasize on each of these parameters more intensely, particularly in first few till we are fully aware of how to incorporate that in our 12 pages. And as Rita mentioned, that there are some additional pages that you can get benefited of and add as other information, and some of that may affect your score, some of that may not affect your score. So I will answer all the questions, and I also have brought something, a flyer here, which tells why they have included some of these things into the grant application and why it is so necessary to include all that. So with that, I would say I'm open to questions. If you have any questions in mind while writing, you can ask me questions and I will try to give all the answers. But it may be my bias because I have not seen in the study section how other people are handling those questions. Thank you.
So I might jump in and say that we recognize that because of the timing of the implementation of these expectations, these are the first grants that are actually being reviewed with these expectations going into the May and June study sections. And so while we are greatly appreciative of our panelists for joining us today a couple of weeks in advance of the actual study section discussions, we wanted to be sure to give the opportunity and the feedback to you as our audience and as our investigator applicants, recognizing that there are June 5 and July 5 deadlines right on our heels. So just so everybody knows, we will be eager to invite everyone back in a couple of months to hear what actually went down in the actual deliberations at the NIH. But in the meantime, perhaps my colleague David Redden could to monitor the scientific rigor.
Yeah, so I was going to I would like Dr. Chen to introduce herself, and then we'll go on and introduce the rest of the panelists. And I know that I per se have several questions actually that I've been thinking about as we've been working on trying to get multiple things set up in collaboration through the CCTS program. Just to go from there. But Dr. Chen, would you just please give your background and experience in study section?
My name is Yabing Chen. I'm a professor in pathology, and I've been a standing member for the VCMB, Vascular Biology and Molecular Medicine study section in the past 3 years. My term ending next year. So what I gathered from the conference or teleconference and my communication with the SRO is, it is okay. Don't stress out if you did not include any specific section, say scientific rigor, premise, or whatever. However, we will be looking the components in your significance area, looking for the scientific premise. And then the specific for the scientific rigors, we're looking in the approach section. You don't have to have a specific. I've been reviewing maybe 8 out of 10 of my assignment for the June cycle. Maybe 2 of them have a specific 1 paragraph says scientific premise, but the other large 3 or 4 for the significance. So we can look more in the significant parts for that premise more than what you have included in that small paragraph. So that's one thing. Don't stress out if you don't have one look into. It's okay for this, at least for this round. And the other thing for the rigorous part, we look not only in your experiment design, also looking into the preliminary data. Do you have very strong, robust assay, unbiased interpretation of your data? So that's very critical. And also in your experiment design, especially for those in vivo studies, I mean animal studies and human studies, you have enough power calculation, and your statistical analysis is accurate or very powerful. So that's very critical in that part. And another thing I learned is some people turn to overstuffing their statistics section in the animals, in the animal section or in the human section. Do not do that because that would take your score out. So that's a little concern there.
Why?
It's annoying.
Because I think
Because
my gut reaction is the reason they don't want you to do that is they see that as trying to circumvent the paper.
no, when we review grants, so we look at your scientific merit first, and the animals will be the last section. It does not count for your scientific merit. Only have problem with the animals. So that's the section, not for your to use the space for your experiment design or anything else. Is to justify your using the animal correctly.
So it's, yeah, so I've been told explicitly by the I've been told explicitly by the SRO to sit. So if someone said, oh, well, I think that was in the animal section, that they will actually say to you, no, it needs to be within that 12-page part of the grant to be stating what the experimental design is, what your even like sample sizes and all that. It can't just be say C burger animal section. And I've been seeing that actually a lot. And people, I don't know, they're trying to maximize the space. But then if you take it all out of the main body of the grant, you can't really evaluate at the same time you evaluate the rest of the scientific grant. But you're flipping through trying to find it. You don't know exactly where it fits, and it just doesn't. It's not cohesive.
And also my experience with the study section in the past few years is whatever you make the reviewer easier to read, and it's better for your grant to get scored better. So otherwise, if you make their life harder, so you know what's going to happen, right? So I think that's the thing. When you're writing a grant, make it very clear for the reviewer. Normally, what I tell people is you try to lead the reviewer for what you want to present and how important the study is. So that's my experience.
We can pass the microphone to Dr. Zhang, and then we can open it up for questions, because one of the things I think I would love to discuss eventually is, when we talk about scientific premise, what's the difference between scientific premise and a literature review, and how that's coming up. So please go ahead and introduce yourself.
So my name is Jianhua Zhang. I'm associate professor in Department of Pathology. I have been in ad hoc NIH study sections, mainly in the NDS study sections, and in the past several years. And my study section will meet in June, so I don't have the experience of rigor and transparency yet, but we have phone calls regarding how to evaluate. So pretty much what the other three panelists said. If you have more questions, or if we are starting to address specific items, I can elaborate.
Okay. So, you want to talk about, I would like you, please, yes.
Yeah, so I think that,
what does it really mean?
So I think that it's a way, to me, it feels as if this is a way to explicitly state how the reviewers view, or how they're going to score the impact and significance. So this is really important. So I find that it's something that when I've been reviewing grants that I've been thinking about, but not explicitly as premise. And so I'll read it and say, do I really buy this? Is this something that do I really think that this is an important area of the field? And so I think this is the part where you can have every other part of your grant be perfect. And if you don't have the premise from the beginning be solid, all the rest of that isn't going to matter. All right, so you can argue, and so there are these tips for you on things you need to address within the premise. And so the first thing, just in the literature review. So I will find that the strongest grants that I have read are not ones that just provide literature leading up to their preliminary data, which is very tempting to do, right? So you have your data and you feel like you're a little bit restricted as to the story you're going to tell because you have this data that's defining your story or your aims or whatever you're doing. And then the tendency is to then kind of build backward in your intro to then lead into your data. That's just, I think, and I see that with the work that I've done to my grants, so then you're trying to build your story based on what's in the literature. I think that approach then limits the scope of your coverage of the field and where your work falls in the field, right? So it's not necessarily just a literature review leading up to whatever your argument is. It literally is, this is a big problem in the field because of this, this, and this. We don't know this piece. So independent of whatever your data is showing, we don't know this, and then you say why the way you're approaching it is the right way to answer that question. And so there definitely is a literature review component to it, but it can't be too restricted because I think what they want you to do is basically to look at all the literature and say, I look at now they're saying strengths and weaknesses of the literature, meaning that you have to acknowledge that there are these not just gaps, not just areas that people don't, study, but actually areas where there are controversies in the field. So I think the best grant that I have in this pile, so I have 8 in this, the one for June, and the best grant in that pile for me was one where it literally said, so this was a particular disorder where there are a lot of neurological disorders associated with aggregation of proteins. So this particular argument was, it's a controversy in the field as to what the toxic form of this protein is, if it's soluble as the aggregate. And we have this data showing this, and we think that this will address a key issue in the field of whether or not soluble or aggregated proteins are really the toxic form or something like that, right? So, and it wasn't
Now, granted, it may be hard with the data you have in front of you to really address this big question, but it's something you can think in the long term, right? How can you really, if you were to sit back and be new to the field and read everything and say, this is a question I need to answer, like, where do you fit in there? Like, is that where your work fits? So I think that, so part is, so addressing the weaknesses and the strengths in the field, maybe what some controversies are, what the gap is, and then how that gap's important, not just the gap. Because there are a lot of grants I've seen where it says no one knows this, ... And I think, do I want to know that? I don't need to know. Why would I need to know, how the toenail's involved in Parkinson's or whatever, right? So it's kind of, there has to be, I think there are layers of premise. There's the initial premise of why it's important in general, but then, getting to your question, that there can't really be any gaps, meaning like, any problem with the conceptual lead into whatever your question is. And so there can be different places where premise goes a little wrong.
One more question maybe before I open it to the floor with regard to just scientific premise, because what I'd like to be able to do is like scientific premise. Then we can talk about the different components. But with regard to the scientific premise, based on what you're seeing, and at least the blogs I've seen on NIH, it's more than a literature review. It's actually being able to state limitations of previous research or even potential limitations within your preliminary data. Are people addressing that to your knowledge, or is that?
So
Rita, could you repeat the question, because I should at least for the reaction.
Right. So the question was that the issue is that one of the requests is that you recognize limitations not only in the field and the literature, but in your own data. So I have not. I did in this group of grants. I've not seen that. I mean, so the closest we got was really when they said there was a controversy in the field. 1 of 8 identified the controversy in the field. The majority of them said there was a gap, but then there was only 1 of them that really said this is a key controversy we need to address, and they didn't say anything really about their own data. So I mean,
well, what about because one of the things that at least I've read in studying this is that they're emphasizing that more than a literature review, identifying the gaps, why it's important, but also if there was like in certain studies they only studied men and pointing out the limitations that are appearing in the literature that are still out there.
I mean, I think that if it's relevant if that's really the key issue of the grant, to point that out. So I think that, but it's just something to think about even when you're structuring your grants, is that to maybe to not feel so bound by your data and think a little bit more about where you fall in kind of the bigger picture of things. And so like just when I see it, I think that some grants I'll see and I'm just not really sold on it, and it ends up being because the premise just isn't really that strong. So other comments?
Yeah, any other comments about premise before we open it to the floor?
So I think, you have limitation of pages. So one thing which is very important, that whatever question you are asking in that grant should justify with the review of literature in a very abridged manner. That's most important. That why your question is so important that you are writing the whole grant on it. So unless you justify that, I don't think that this grant is really very effective, because you have preliminary data, you have everything, but your question is not very relevant. So then, you will not score as good as you should.
To follow up on that, if it takes you 3 pages to get to your point, then that's when you need to reevaluate that, right? So like if you do a model and you diagram things and there are about 18 arrows to get from, I see this actually a lot with behavioral assays. Well, they have like one protein that's disrupted somewhere and then have behavior, and I call it the black box problem, because there's a huge gap in the middle, and mechanistically it's almost impossible to understand how to get from there to that behavior. And so but if it takes that 3 pages to get to whatever the point is, then it's hard for the reviewer to follow the premise at all, to get to the middle of it and not know exactly how that fits in.
Any questions about scientific premise from the group? Yes, ma'am.
So how do you differentiate the premise from background? Because I understand, I'm trying to, what is premise and what is background? Are they the same, or?
So you'll repeat the question.
What is scientific premise?
So she was asking about the difference between scientific premise and background. I think that actually they're woven together, because you're essentially choosing, like in your background, you're using the literature review to build your premise. So I wouldn't think about it as being distinct things, like when you're writing them, think, oh, this is the background. It's a little bit more integrated than that. So, I mean, you don't even necessarily need to have a section that's called background at this point. You could be significance or your premise even, right? You just literally just call it your premise. And then your job is to kind of use the literature, the background literature to build the premise. So that's the way that I think.
So I think it's more like the significance of your study. That's how it falls into. And basically, we all have a favorite molecule to work with. We have a disease model. But how this molecule is so important in this disease, and what have people know about the pathway, and how your study will contribute to advance our knowledge, either the basic knowledge or in the clinical application. I think those two will be very important to add.
Just to follow, just one more thing really quick to follow up on that. So I think it's important that so everyone I think wants to tag on to say they want to find a target for disease or something. So people making the reviewers look at premise makes people really be critical about exactly what you're saying. So if you're saying that, so especially for one of the study sections I'm on, they really do have people that have grants in there that have a drug that could be going into clinical trials. I mean that if someone says in the grant, we are identifying a target for ... that's the expectation of the reviewer. Where if you recognize you're actually on the discovery side and you're understanding mechanism, as long as you say that's what you're doing, the reviewer says, oh, well, that makes sense. I'm understanding the underlying biological basis for Alzheimer's, and so I'm looking at this pathway. That's better than saying we want to identify targets for Alzheimer's and then just say we're studying this protein. Yeah, so there's a little bit of a difference there. But it's kind of just building your premise and really testing what you're saying that you're testing.
I just read some documentation instruction. You have to point out the strengths of your scientific premise, and also you have to give the weakness of your scientific premise. Just I don't know what does this mean. What is the weakness? What is the difference between the scientific weakness and the gap I just didn't understand.
So my gather is the limitation, I think, for whatever you study. You cannot solve all the problems, so you have to spare out from this what we can learn, but still there were some limitations for whatever I proposed.
With the example of, like I said, these protein aggregation diseases, they will, so in maybe some examples where there's a disease susceptibility gene, someone can say, we understand that this may not represent idiopathic disease. This may just be for this family that has this mutation, but understanding that the way that mutation contributes to disease will help us to understand it, although it may not reflect the whole, everyone who has the disease, right? So that's a weakness of you choosing one thing, but you always have, so but as long as you make a good argument for whatever that is and understanding some pathway, then that's the weakness would be that it doesn't apply to literally everyone with that disease, right? So you acknowledge the fact that you're not solving all the problems, but that you're addressing one.
All the panelists, we're going to try to time it so that there's a little bit of time at the very end where we can have discussion with them one-on-one, if possible. So for the sake of trying to get through the 4 that we're going, I was going to ask about biological variables, and with regard to, I did hear you say sex and age. One of the other, but out of curiosity for me and all the grants that I've been working with, those are the 2 that keep coming up. Has anyone raised any other variables that might be?
So when you write a grant on humans, you also address race, for example. So that's a variable. Mm-hmm. But in mouse, unless you are doing something which is related to different strains of mouse, you don't address normally that, because each mouse model, for example, I work on carcinogenesis, C57 black is a resistant, whereas FVB is a susceptible mouse model. So we say that, and then we start working on FVB model, but we introduce why we are selecting this versus not the others, where there are a lot of reagents which are available. So, you have to justify with limited words, because you see, I was addressing to her question also that when the grant was 24 pages, we used to write background in 4 or 5 pages, and now you have to write within 1 page, mostly 1 page. You are not limited to, but if you use more, then you have less pages for your preliminary data and other things. The significance and innovation. So when you write something, you be brief as possible, but you cover whole thing and you make reviewer understand that why and how you want to attempt the question. So if that is there, then I think your grant is very good.
Could I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
Could I take the, yes?
So in the context of a limited number of pages, one of the possibilities that has come up, I gather, with the new assessment of rigor and reproducibility is there can be an appendix. Have you gotten instructions from your study section exec sex as to what can be in the appendix, what should be in the appendix, and what must be included in the body of the grant?
So everything that is scoring should be in the body of the grant. As somebody said here just now, that if you are, he asked the question that why I should not put details in the animal section rather than in my grant, because it's a competitive venture and everybody is being reviewed what he has put in 12 pages. So that limitation, within that limitation, everything should be addressed. If it is not there and you are utilizing extra pages to explain your science or something else, you are not doing the same thing as others are doing. You are overcoming that limitation. So it is written that, say for example, in rigor section or in transparency or in other things where the appendices are allowed, you need to mention only those things which are there, like how will you validate your reagent, so you have an appendix. If reviewer is interested in reading that and he thinks that that particular antibody or something needs to be validated, he will go back in your appendix and he will try to understand about it. But if he thinks that no, you have the data and everything is fine, he need not to go, So I mean, in other words, reviewers should not be compelled to go into literature and something else to look into, and that's why they say that when you send something as an information, additional information before the review of grant, it is not necessary that reviewer sees it. Usually we try to see it and try to put the benefit of that if your paper is accepted or everything. But at the deadline, most of the things that you put into the paper, that is the main consideration.
So I mentioned earlier, just to clarify, scientific rigor's premise has to be in your main body, the 12-page limitation. And but the reagent authentication, though that could be in the appendix, but those are not scored. So that's in the appendix.
Well, it has to be. It's a required page.
Yeah.
So
And
it's actually not called the appendix. It's actually called authentication of biological. Right. So there's actually a separate form when you pull up the download the package for the grant. There actually is that form already or it allows you to attach a document in that slot, basically, right? So like all these other, these packages you download, you stick in your specific aims page and all that. There's a spot to do that. Yep. And that's where you're basically saying mouse lines, cell lines, antibodies are the most common things that I've seen, where you basically say, we know this cell line has been validated for ... This mouse line has been generated here, and we've validated by genotyping and by all these things. Antibodies have been validated and its specificity has been addressed by ... within one page. Like
but it's not, you're right, it's not an appendix, it's a lot.
No.
Right.
It's a
Required section.
in that one page, the things, do I need to including all the resource of my antibody like this what company? And for the animal model, if it's a homemade animal model, do I have to republish some part is not exactly the same, but publish majority of technique to make this animal model? Do I have to state in that one page the details, how I made that animal model?
Animal model, I think if you publish it, you can describe it in some extent, but do not do too much. But in addition to that, I think if you made antibody, that need validation, and then you have to do something on that.
That would be in that one page.
Right.
But I've seen mainly text though, like it's not usually figures that are put in there. So, but if a mouse line though, that could end up falling into premise, right? So some of these things actually are help you, like you said, this is the model we need to use. You wouldn't put that in the authentication section. You would have justification of your model as part of the rigor and the premise of your grant, right? So you have to decide kind of where.
I know what I've done on the authentication page, but I don't know how it's been reviewed. That's happening next week, so I won't say for sure. And, but I know that what's been advocated, I guess, by many is if you have cell lines that you use, and what they're worried about, and it's a valid worry, is the T47D cells that I'm using have no relationship to the T47D cells that the other guy is using because God knows what's happening. So sometimes I guess if they're bought from ATCC, that's probably a reasonable thing to say because at least if you buy them from them, they've validated them. I guess, what have they told you about other ways that you can demonstrate validity? Or have they told you?
For cell lines?
Yeah, for example, or for antibodies for that.
So like how
So we've actually, what we've actually had, I mean, I personally have had very little guidance on specific tools like that, right?
That doesn't surprise me, but
Yeah, so there's been very little guidance there. I mean, I guess you could argue that if you're looking at a certain gene, that you would make sure that there, I don't know if you could, sequence it, make sure there aren't SNPs in it, they're different from another cell line. I don't know. I'm not sure how.
okay, I don't think anybody knows. Yeah, I'm just wondering what they tell me.
I think ATCC provides a service that they actually check your cell line.
Like for ATCC, I think all I have to really say in my view, this is my view, is we're going to purchase these cells from ATCC catalog number, whatever, because it's obvious that they've authenticated. I think it's more tricky with antibodies.
And I was talking about once you get it, and once you're using them, there's a service that you can send the cells back to ATCC.
Sure. And that's very true. What I guess we're trying to figure out is what to put in your grant.
Well, I said I would send.
Okay, so that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
If it's some weird cell line, what are they comparing it to?
Well, I mean, yeah, I'm working with established cell lines that you can buy from ATCC.
I think those are less problematic.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the authentication of chemical resources? What does that mean?
So if you are buying chemical from Sigma and it says that purity is more than 99.9%, it's okay. But if you have some chemical that you have synthesized in the lab or you have got from somewhere, some chemist that is your collaborator, you need to authenticate that chemical by GC, mass, LC, whatever way you can show that it has certain degree of purity, and if it has impurity, what kind of impurity it is affecting your assay system or it is affecting your targets or not.
So if it's bought from Sigma, you stated in the authentication page.
Right, you say that you bought it from Sigma and the purity is 99.9%. Also, most of the chemicals that you make may be contaminated with certain biologicals or fungal products. So,
Speak for yourself.
not cells. So I think how you have eliminated that, because Sigma says that it is free of those things. So, that's why it is more expensive than if you buy from Fluka or somewhere else, which has not been tested for those contaminations.
Any other question on authentication or biological variables before I get to my favorite, scientific rigor? Yes, sir, go ahead.
Last comment. So the authentication part, my SRO is saying you needed to have a plan. You don't have to already authenticate it. And it's a non-scorable thing. And before funding, they will ask you for it. If you just happen to not providing it this round, they will ask you for it if your grant is within the funding range.
So in other words, you will not get a NOGA until they see this particular element of the document.
But just providing it doesn't get you the NOGA.
No, if you have used it in preliminary data, it should be a part of your description.
Go to your favorite?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, anybody on the panel with regard to the feedback and guidance that y'all have received with regard to scientific rigor. You know, Jennifer and I were doing back in December discussions on all of these concepts, and there were certain strategies that we put into place with regard to echoing words about rigor and reproducibility within the significance of, the approach section, highlighting how we would go about and validate the assumptions statistically, getting a lot, what we've done for many years, but also in a way putting a flashlight or a spotlight on it. I just want your comments about, are you seeing that strategy, or?
And actually, I asked the SIO in our teleconference. So 2 keywords. One is robust assay, and the other one is unbiased. So those two very critical. And when talking about that, is you have to describe your design or whatever very in enough details. Then somebody else, if you want to repeat your experiment, they know how to do it and they can repeat it. So that's how that affects the reproducibility.
See, because I think of 2 definitions of reproducibility. I think about the one that you just gave, that instructions that somebody else can go into a lab, but also enough instruction that they had the data set, that they would know what the statisticians and the analysts had done to it, or were planning to do to it, to be able to produce results.
So that's how you analyze and interpret the data. So that's another thing. So for example, there was a question regarding if the method this one particular statistician analyzed does not agreed by the other statistician. So who is the judge? Who can say is the NIH stat has the final say? So that's something. And the other thing is unbiased analysis. For those people who do immunostaining, you have to score them. You have to do analyze. Those are subjective, but you can do unbiased analysis, say using 2 different people, and blinded analyze. But before you do that, you have to set up your protocol. So you have to provide a specific terminology or guideline how we look at this. So you have to define your methodology. So that's what
I think one example of that is when I'm reviewing something and I'll see someone say that they'll use stereology. So that's a kind of a phrase that I'm just going to spit out. If there are certain cell types that die in the brain in a certain disorder, and they'll just say, well, we'll assess cell number of stereology. And it's just really not that simple. People who do stereology know that. So when I see that, and I see that there aren't necessarily references from that group who've done stereology, I would want to know how many sections were selected, like what level we're talking about here, right? So like what the number of sections, the number of animals, the number of, how the regions were selected. So more details on exactly how that experiment will be done, because those things aren't trivial. So if there's a large experiment that's represented by 2 words, then most often I think the reviewer will say, well, unless they've really done a lot of it. Even in the case you've done a lot of it, you still want to know maybe what the sampling was like and what your ends were like.
For example, if you're not studying Western blots, ELISA, this is the common method. Do I have to detail what I'm going to do? No, don't need, right?
So another important thing is outliers. So, you have to define what you are going to eliminate in your analysis, and this should be preset. This should not be after seeing the data. That's biased and unbiased. So if you are doing tumor experiment and one mice gets 20 tumors, rest of the batch is between 8 to 12, for example, and you are saying that this is outlier, this is somehow getting a lot more tumors than rest of the batch. So you have to define that any mice getting this much tumors will be eliminated, or getting no tumors will be eliminated, something like that. So you should have a defined protocol to make outliers out of your studies. And then, when the results come, you based on that section, as she said, that you have to have rules for your assessment. That how will you assess a slide or a mouse data or anything? Anybody does follow your rules, then he reaches to the same, or she reaches to the same conclusion.
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to add a comment about the question about Western blotting. So you may not want to define how you're going to do a Western, but you probably want to say, I'm going to do these controls. I will have this positive control. I will have this negative control. I will use this antibody from this company, and I will do densitometry in this way every time and have 2 people evaluate it. So they don't want details about the Western. They want to know how you're going to use the information.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's correct. That's what I would. So you ask about how much details about the methods or the protocol you want to put in. Just enough to have people know what antibody you use, why, what are your control group, and what are you anticipated to get. So that's sufficient. And also regarding the n numbers, n equals how many, especially for those people who does taking the primary samples from mouse, say we use smooth muscle cells from animals, and n equals 3 means at least you get tissue from 3 independent mice. Not just from one mouse, I do 3 times. So that's n equals 1.
I mean, the real world grant writing is that if you went to this detail in every experiment, you would never have the data limits possible. So the art is trying to do this in a way that's conveying that you know what you're doing and you're going to do it reliably. I mean, Molly, it's a reasonable question to say how you're going to do the analysis of each Western blot, and I don't mean how you're going to transfer it to nitrocellulose, but how you're going to analyze it. But if you did that for every experiment, there'd be nothing else on Earth. So it seems clearly that reviewers, I'm imagining, have a brain in their head, and they're going to obviously say, if you've done it before and you've shown the statistical analysis in your previous papers, and you reference it appropriately, that has to count for something. Otherwise, we're just at a standstill. It can't be.
That's what I look, and I do not look into details, especially for Western blots. Yeah, then they have published several papers on this, why I have the doubt their methods.
So our conversation with the SRO is we emphasize also reviewing grants is still based on impact. It's not approach-based reviewing process. So we still need to focus on whether these proposal will have an impact in the field, not just if you have all the approaches and details in, you get the grant. It's still based on impact, not approach.
You just want to make sure you have a long impact. Just all data.
Well, you want to make sure your data will support your impact. Your data is not some random collection of stuff.
You come back to the Rigor things. I want to really review happy. So they will be happier when they see the section that name the Rigor and the transformation. That section, if that is, I'm going to write that section. But what the key word I need to put that 2 line or 3 lines.
So I asked my SIO specifically, for at least for this round, we don't have some specific heading, say scientific rigor. And in our scoring sheets, there is no section for scientific rigor. It goes to the significance section. The rigor approach, yeah, approach.
So So I think I can only speak for myself. As a reviewer, I don't like to have all the buzzwords fitting into the grant without substance. I like to see the overall grant to be rigorous rather than having all the words rigor written every paragraph.
So for the sake of time, what I was going to do is we're going to go on and there's a few more slides that we want to talk about, potential resources where you can find things to get feedback or at least examples of what's being taught. We're going to reinforce a couple more points. But I'm going to try to do this in a matter of exactly 6 minutes so that there'll be time that if y'all have further questions and can mingle with the panelists for just a few minutes, we'll do our best to allow that time. So thank you for the questions. If you have more, hold on. There'll be another opportunity. But what I do want to emphasize to you is, again, these are the key things, and we're going to emphasize. Stand by the microphone. Thank you, Brian. The key things, is you heard it over and over. There are the key four. There are the four: the scientific premise, the authentication, the relevant biological variables, rigorous experimental design. Jennifer and I have talked about this many, many times. Really, the newest piece is the authentication. That's the one-page piece. These other things actually have been emphasized for several years, but we're asking for a greater magnifying or a spotlight on these and a greater emphasis and clarity in how these things justify the specific aims that you have. So I believe that's the gist. Now, over the past 6 months, we've been monitoring and watching what NIH has been putting out on their web pages, reviewing different things, designing multiple grants through the CCTS, BIRD, and Research Commons, trying to assist individuals in producing these things or in providing rigor and reproducibility in their grants. The key thing that I want you to understand is exactly what every one of the panelists, I believe, said exactly 3 times as I was paying attention to what was going on. Keep in mind that they are looking for specific things in specific areas. If you're looking, when they're talking about scientific premise, they're expecting to see it under research strategy. That's what NIH wants you to emphasize it there. Scientific rigor, where you're coming in and you're discussing all the different techniques, all the justification of the way you're going, the analysis plan, the power calculation, the archiving of the data, all of these things, they're expecting to see that under approach. Again, relevant biological variables also falls underneath, research strategy. I'm sorry about that. It's research strategy, and the research strategy, and then the final one is the new attachment. So when you're writing your grant, the 3 scorables fall inside the research strategy: significance, approach, and approach. Now, I'm going to date myself. I'm old enough to remember actually receiving the pink sheets when they were pink and they were paper. Now, the catch here is what I'm eager to see over the next several weeks is all the grants that the CCTS assisted in designing. I will be very carefully studying the significance, the approach, critiques that come back on the pink sheets to see if our ability to emphasize these things were recognized. I'm eager to see. We put our best foot forward. I will always be proud of that. If we get specific critiques and arguments with regard to what we've done, I'm going to show you exactly where we're going to post those and list them out for your ability to say, okay, that didn't work, this did work. Hopefully, I'm going to be posting a lot more things that did work than those things that did not work. Where can you get some help if you need the help? We all need help. I'm a firm believer in team science. This is why we pulled this all together, so that we can all learn from each other's experiences, also be able to build off of each other's resources and be able to work together as a team. So with regard to all of these things, we can give you feedback. We'll emphasize with you and help you recognize through panels and what's going to be scored, the CCTS and the Research Commons. Any grant going in you can reach out to the CCTS, and we will be able, with sufficient time, if you can get it to us, we will form a panel and almost do a mock study section for you before it goes in. And this has been extremely beneficial over the past several years for individuals putting in applications, and I strongly encourage you to use the resource. I will also strongly encourage you to use the resource of the BIRD unit inside the CCTS, which is the Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design group. We have a large group of methodologists. We spend a lot of time talking about how do you detect the outliers? How do you build robust designs? How do we include approaches that can increase and make certain that the analyses are unbiased? How can we make certain that everything is statistically reproducible? We've got large sections now of how we can increase the statistical rigor by allowing an independent statistician to analyze a blinded data set to see if the same conclusions are being made. So I'd encourage you to use the Research Commons to reach out to us and to take advantage of these resources. The other thing that's a very great, or at least in my opinion, a very good, I'll say a very great, but it's not great English. A great resource is the web page. If you would go and you look under Research Commons, we have at the top piece, where else would you put it, grant help, because that's what we really want to assist you with. And underneath that, you will see that we have sections now where we're storing documents for rigor and transparency, and that those resources are there and available to you. And if you have questions about them, then please reach out to us. And I'm over. And so I've only left 4 minutes now for you to be able to mingle. If you have questions, reach out to us at Research Commons. I want to thank the panelists, and I also want to remind all of you that the forum is actually monthly. However, we moved June up into May, so we will be seeing you in July. Okay, thank you very much.